The flight was supposed to be smooth, just another routine trip. But when a flight attendant coldly separated an elderly couple, refusing to let them sit together, she had no idea who they really were. She thought they were just another pair of old passengers, insignificant, easy to ignore. But within hours, the entire plane would witness a downfall so shocking that no one saw it coming. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories where the powerful get humbled, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. An elderly couple, Leonard and Evelyn Carter, boarded their flight, their fingers lightly intertwined as they stepped into the first-class cabin. Leonard, dressed in a crisp button-up shirt with a navy blazer, carried himself with quiet dignity. Evelyn, in a soft, pink cardigan and pearl earrings, adjusted the strap of her handbag and smiled at her husband. This trip had been planned for months, a well-earned vacation after years of hard work. They had booked first-class seats side by side, wanting to enjoy their journey together. But as they reached their row, Evelyn's smile faded. She glanced down at her ticket, then up at the seat numbers, her brows knitting together. Leonard checked his own ticket again, then looked at the seats before them. The airline had made a mistake. Instead of being seated together, Evelyn's assigned seat was a row behind Leonard's. She turned toward a nearby flight attendant, a tall woman with tightly pinned blonde hair and sharp features. The name tag on her uniform read, Ms. Collins. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice polite but firm. "Excuse me, dear. I believe there's been a mistake. My husband and I booked our seats together, but we've been placed in different rows." She extended her ticket toward Ms. Collins, hoping for a simple fix. Ms. Collins barely spared the ticket a glance before sighing. "Seats are assigned ahead of time, ma'am. If you wanted to sit together, you should have booked them properly." Leonard's jaw tensed slightly, though his tone remained calm. "We did book them together. The airline must have reassigned us." He gestured to the empty seat beside his. "If there's any way to switch my wife's seat to this one, we'd appreciate it." Ms. Collins exhaled sharply, her expression growing impatient. "Sir, we don't make changes after boarding. You'll have to find someone willing to switch on your own." Her tone was dismissive, as if the request was beneath her. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand policies, but this was an airline error. Surely there's something you can do." Ms. Collins folded her arms. "Look, first class is full. No special accommodations." She glanced at the wife's ticket again, barely giving it a second thought before handing it back. "Just take your assigned seats." A few passengers nearby looked up from their books or phones, subtly watching the interaction. Some turned away quickly, while others exchanged quiet glances. Leonard sighed, adjusting his watch, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without another word, he typed a short message and hit send. Ms. Collins didn't notice. She was already turning away, moving down the aisle with an air of authority, convinced that the matter had been settled. But it wasn't settled, not even close. Leonard slid his phone back into his pocket, his face unreadable. Evelyn glanced at him, sensing something in his expression, a quiet patience that only meant one thing. He wasn't going to argue. He was going to let things unfold. She trusted him, so she simply adjusted her cardigan and took her assigned seat, though the disappointment lingered in her eyes. A few minutes passed as the cabin filled with the soft rustling of passengers settling in. Ms. Collins moved through the aisle with the same stiff confidence, offering pleasantries to select passengers, but barely sparing Evelyn or Leonard another glance. She made it clear who she deemed important in this cabin, and they were not on that list. Further up, another flight attendant, Daniel, was handing out pre-flight beverages. Unlike Ms. Collins, he carried himself with warmth, offering each passenger a smile along with their drinks. When he reached Leonard, he noticed the empty seat beside him and then spotted Evelyn sitting behind. His brow furrowed slightly. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, sir?" Daniel asked politely. Leonard gave a small nod. "Water, please." Daniel handed him the glass and hesitated before adding, "I couldn't help but notice. You and your wife seem to have been seated apart." Leonard took a sip of his water, then looked up at the young attendant. "Yes, we asked if there was a way to switch, but we were told it wasn't possible." Daniel's eyes flickered toward Miss Collins, who was now at the front of the cabin, straightening trays. He had worked with her long enough to know her type, strict to the point of arrogance, with little regard for passengers who didn't fit her idea of worthy. "I see," Daniel said carefully. "I can check if anyone would be willing to swap seats. Most people don't mind small changes." Before Leonard could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Daniel, let's keep things moving," Miss Collins called from the front. Her tone was firm, laced with authority. No need to disturb the seating arrangements. Daniel hesitated. He knew Miss Collins had been with the airline much longer than he had. Challenging her wasn't wise, but something about the way she had dismissed the elderly couple didn't sit right with him. Leonard simply offered Daniel a knowing smile. "No need to trouble yourself. We'll be just fine." Daniel gave a slow nod, then moved on, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation wasn't over yet. Miss Collins, however, had already dismissed the matter from her mind. To her, it was over. She had given an answer, and that was that. But as she prepared to close the first-class cabin doors, the intercom crackled to life. "Miss Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately." The entire first-class cabin fell into an eerie silence. Miss Collins stiffened, her posture still rigid, but her steps noticeably slower as she walked toward the front of the plane. Something was happening, and she was about to find out what. Miss Collins adjusted her uniform as she approached the cockpit door, her mind racing. Calls to the cockpit before takeoff were rare, and usually only meant one of two things. Either there was an urgent situation or a last-minute directive from the airline's executives. Neither possibility sat well with her. She knocked once before stepping inside. The captain, Richard Hayes, a seasoned pilot with salt and pepper hair, was seated in his chair, his headset resting around his neck. Beside him, the co-pilot, Amanda Rhodes, was monitoring flight systems. But it was neither of them who had requested Miss Collins. On the small screen beside the flight panel, a live video feed was active. A serious-looking man in a tailored navy blue suit filled the frame. His presence alone sent a chill down Miss Collins' spine. Benjamin Carter, CEO of Carter Airlines. Her throat went dry. "Miss Collins," Benjamin's voice was even, but there was an unmistakable weight to it. "Can you explain why my parents have been separated on their own airline?" The air inside the cockpit suddenly felt heavier. Miss Collins blinked rapidly, struggling to process the words. His parents? The elderly couple she had brushed off moments ago, Leonard and Evelyn Carter, owned this airline? I wasn't aware of their identity, sir," she stammered, her usual sharp tone replaced with something much weaker. "It was a seating issue, and I was simply following protocol." Benjamin didn't react, his piercing gaze unyielding. "Protocol?" He leaned forward slightly. "Let's go over that. Did you check the passenger manifest before dismissing their request?" Miss Collins hesitated. The truth was she hadn't. She had assumed, like she often did, that they were just another set of elderly passengers trying to make last-minute changes. "No, sir," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence on the other end of the call made her stomach twist. Captain Hayes exchanged a glance with Amanda, then cleared his throat. "Sir, would you like us to arrange for their seats to be corrected now?" Benjamin's expression remained unreadable. "Yes, immediately. And I want Miss Collins to personally escort them back to their rightful seats and apologize in front of the entire first-class cabin." Miss Collins felt a deep humiliation creeping up her spine. She had always commanded authority on flights. She had always been the one in control. But now, with one mistake, she was powerless. "Understood, sir," she said, forcing the words out. Benjamin nodded once, then the screen went dark. Miss Collins turned back toward the cockpit door, her hands clammy. She had made a mistake, a very public, career-damaging mistake. And now she had no choice but to walk back into that cabin and face the very people she had dismissed. As she stepped out, she could already feel eyes shifting toward her. The passengers could sense something had changed. She swallowed hard, straightened her uniform, and made her way down the aisle toward Leonard and Evelyn. The very moment she had ignored them, she had unknowingly sealed her fate, and now the consequences were about to begin. Ms. Collins walked down the aisle, her steps measured but noticeably slower than before. The first-class cabin, once filled with quiet conversations and the occasional clink of glasses, had grown unusually silent. Passengers sensed something was off. Some glanced up from their screens, others leaned slightly forward, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Leonard sat comfortably in his seat, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest. His expression was unreadable, but Evelyn, seated behind him, had a soft, knowing smile on her face. She wasn't smug, nor angry, just patient. Miss Collins cleared her throat as she reached them, forcing a polite smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she began, voice thinner than before. "There's been a—" She hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't make this worse. "A misunderstanding. I've been instructed to move Mrs. Carter to her rightful seat next to her husband." A few passengers exchanged glances. They had all heard the way she had dismissed the couple earlier, and now here she was, backtracking. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "A misunderstanding." Her tone was gentle, but there was something in her eyes that made Miss Collins' stomach twist. Miss Collins forced another tight-lipped smile. "Yes, and I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Leonard exhaled slowly, stretching his legs before finally looking up at her. "You told us first class was full," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That seating could not be adjusted." Ms. Collins swallowed. She knew there was no way out of this, but she still had to keep her composure. I may have spoken too quickly," she admitted. "I should have checked with the manifest before making that decision." Evelyn remained seated. She hadn't even reached for her bag yet. She simply looked up at Ms. Collins and asked, "Why didn't you check?" Ms. Collins stiffened. She hadn't expected that question. Not in front of everyone. More heads turned now, passengers openly watching, waiting to see what she would say. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew exactly why she hadn't checked. She had assumed they were just another elderly couple asking for special treatment. She had dismissed them. Leonard watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "You made an assumption?" Ms. Collins' fingers clenched at her sides. The silence stretched between them, the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. Evelyn finally stood, taking her handbag. She turned to her husband, offering him a reassuring smile before stepping toward him. But before sitting down, she looked at Ms. Collins one last time. "We weren't asking for special treatment," Evelyn said softly. "We were asking to be treated fairly." The words hit harder than Ms. Collins had expected. She swallowed the bitter lump in her throat and stepped back as Evelyn took her seat beside Leonard. The moment should have passed, but it didn't. The other passengers were still watching, some murmuring quietly, some shaking their heads. Ms. Collins had never felt so small in her career, and it was only the beginning. Ms. Collins took a step back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The usual authority she carried in first class had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable stiffness in her posture. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares pressing against her, a silent judgment hanging in the air. Evelyn settled into her seat, adjusting her cardigan as if nothing had happened. Leonard, still calm, reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. The ease in their demeanor made Ms. Collins' stomach twist even more. They weren't gloating. They weren't demanding anything. They had simply let her expose herself. A few rows away, Daniel, the younger flight attendant, had been watching. He had seen passengers complain before, seen heated exchanges over seat changes, but never had he seen a senior flight attendant be forced to backtrack like this. He glanced at a businessman seated near him, one of the passengers who had also been watching, and the man raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, that was awkward." Ms. Collins cleared her throat, trying to regain some sense of authority. "If there's anything else I can do to make your flight comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." The words felt forced, almost robotic. Leonard leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "We'll be just fine." Evelyn simply nodded, turning her attention to the window as if the conversation had never happened. Ms. Collins hesitated for a moment longer, then quickly turned on her heel and walked back toward the galley, her breath unsteady. She didn't stop moving until she was behind the curtain, out of sight from the passengers. Daniel, who had been refilling drinks, glanced at her. "That was something," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Ms. Collins shot him a glare, her jaw tight. "I don't need commentary, Daniel." He held up his hands. Just saying, you don't usually apologize to passengers. Ms. Collins yanked a napkin from the stack and dabbed at her forehead. I didn't have a choice. Daniel shrugged, leaning against the counter. Guess that's what happens when you don't know who you're talking to. She stiffened at his words, the full weight of the situation sinking in. She had spent years controlling the first-class cabin, setting the tone, deciding who received what level of attention. She had dismissed countless passengers before, making split-second judgments about them. But this time, she had dismissed the wrong people. And the worst part? She had no idea what else was coming. Ms. Collins pressed her palms against the cold metal counter in the galley, inhaling sharply through her nose. Her heart was still racing, though she forced herself to appear composed. The humiliation from her public apology clung to her skin like a heavy coat. She had never been forced to swallow her pride like that, not in front of an entire cabin, not in front of her own crew. Daniel was still lingering nearby, casually arranging glasses on a tray, but his eyes flicked toward her every so often, amusement hidden behind his polite expression. Rough day? He murmured, knowing full well she was already on edge. She shot him a cold glance. Not in the mood, Daniel. He smirked but said nothing. Ms. Collins exhaled, forcing her mind to refocus. She had made a mistake. Fine. It was over. The couple had their seats, and she had apologized. That was the end of it. She just needed to get through the rest of the flight without any more issues. Straightening her uniform, she stepped out of the galley and walked back into the first-class cabin. Passengers had returned to their distractions, some reading, some working on laptops, some still sipping champagne. But there was a noticeable shift. She could feel it, the way a few of them glanced at her before quickly looking away, the slight tension that lingered, like the remnants of a storm that had passed but left its mark. She hated it. For years she had commanded silent authority on flights. Her presence alone was enough to maintain order. But now, for the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, a loss of control, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. As she moved toward the front of the cabin, her attention flickered toward Leonard and Evelyn. They weren't gloating. They weren't even looking at her. Evelyn was adjusting a blanket over her lap, her hands slow and methodical. Leonard had a newspaper unfolded in front of him, though it was unclear if he was actually reading it or simply using it as a way to avoid unnecessary conversation. They were too calm. Ms. Collins had dealt with difficult passengers before, people who complained about service, demanded better meals, or acted like they were more important than they really were. But Leonard and Evelyn weren't difficult. They hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't insisted she be punished. They had simply let her own actions dig her grave. Her jaw tightened as she continued walking, but before she could reach the front of the cabin, the intercom crackled again. Ms. Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately. She stopped mid-step, a chill running through her. Not again. Passengers looked up, some exchanging quiet murmurs. Even Daniel, who had just stepped into the aisle to collect glasses, raised an eyebrow. Ms. Collins' throat felt tight, but she quickly turned on her heel and made her way back toward the cockpit, her polished heels clicking against the carpet. She entered and immediately felt the tension in the air. Captain Hayes was seated, his expression unreadable, but his gaze was sharp. Beside him, Amanda Rhodes had her arms crossed, her face neutral but alert. And then, just like before, the video screen was on. Only this time, it wasn't just Benjamin Carter staring back at her. There were two additional faces on the screen. Board members from Carter Airlines. Her stomach twisted painfully. Ms. Collins, Benjamin said, his voice still measured but noticeably colder than before. I'd like to ask you something very simple. She swallowed. Yes, sir? His eyes didn't leave hers. Are you aware that this flight is currently under executive review? Her pulse hammered. Executive review? That only happened when major complaints were filed against an employee mid-flight. I wasn't informed of that, she admitted, her voice barely steady. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. It was just initiated a few minutes ago. He gestured toward the board members on the screen. Given the incident earlier, we've decided to monitor the remainder of the flight closely. How you conduct yourself from this point forward will determine the outcome of your employment. The words nearly knocked the air from her lungs. Her employment? I, I understand, she stammered. One of the board members, an older woman with sharp glasses and a navy blue blazer, finally spoke. Ms. Collins, your handling of a first-class passenger was not just unprofessional, it was a complete failure of customer service. You didn't just refuse a request, you dismissed them. I didn't know who they were, Ms. Collins tried to explain. The woman's expression didn't change. That's precisely the problem. You made a snap judgment about them. You assumed they weren't important. Tell me, how often do you make those kinds of assumptions? Ms. Collins opened her mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched between them. Benjamin finally sighed and leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen, Ms. Collins. You're going to return to the cabin and complete the flight with professionalism. You're going to treat every passenger with the same level of courtesy that should have been given to my parents from the start. He let the words settle before continuing. Then once we land, you will report to the executive office for a formal review of your position with this airline. Ms. Collins felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to say that she had worked for this airline for years, but there was nothing she could say that would erase what had already happened. She had been so sure of herself earlier, so dismissive, and now she wasn't just losing control of the cabin, she was on the verge of losing her career. Benjamin's voice was quieter when he spoke next, but it carried more weight than before. Let's see if you can make it through the rest of the flight without another mistake. The screen went dark. Ms. Collins stood frozen for a moment before Captain Hayes cleared his throat. I'd suggest you get back to work, Miss Collins, he said evenly. Her legs felt weak as she stepped out of the cockpit. The flight wasn't even halfway over, and she had never wanted to be on the ground more in her entire life. Ms. Collins walked out of the cockpit, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The air in the first-class cabin felt heavier, the pressure of watchful eyes suffocating. She knew the passengers were paying attention, even if they pretended not to. The ones who had overheard her earlier now sat with quiet amusement, some stealing glances as she made her way back. She wasn't just another flight attendant anymore. She was the woman who had tried to humiliate a couple that owned the airline, and now she was under investigation mid-flight. Her grip on the beverage cart tightened as she forced herself to resume her duties. Her hands were steady, but the back of her neck burned with humiliation. It was unbearable. She had always been the one in control, the one passengers had to respect, the one who made the rules on board. But now, the balance of power had shifted completely, and she had never felt smaller. As she reached Leonard and Evelyn's row, she could feel their presence before even looking up. Evelyn was still nestled comfortably in her seat, smoothing out the soft airline blanket over her lap. Leonard, calm as ever, had a book open in front of him, though it was impossible to tell if he was actually reading it or simply waiting. She cleared her throat. Would either of you like a refreshment? Evelyn looked up, a pleasant but unreadable smile on her face. Oh, now we're being offered service? Ms. Collins' stomach twisted. Leonard slowly turned the page of his book before glancing up at her. I'll have sparkling water, he said, his voice cool but polite. Ms. Collins nodded stiffly, pouring the drink. She set the glass carefully on his tray table, though her fingers were gripping the bottle harder than necessary. And for you, Mrs. Carter. Evelyn tapped her chin thoughtfully. I think I'll have tea. Ms. Collins immediately reached for the tea packets, her movements precise. As she prepared the drink, Evelyn continued, her tone casual but deliberate. You know, Leonard and I fly quite often. We've met a lot of flight attendants over the years. Some are wonderful, genuinely kind. She accepted the tea with a polite nod, then added softly, and some forget that the people they serve are people too. Miss Collins felt her pulse quicken. Leonard closed his book and adjusted his glasses. It's funny how quickly respect changes when people realize who they're talking to. Ms. Collins swallowed. Mr. Carter, He held up a hand, stopping her. No need to explain, he said simply. You already did. Her mouth went dry. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't threatening her job. He was letting her sit in her own mistake. She gave a small nod, muttered a barely audible, "Enjoy your drinks," and turned away as quickly as she could without drawing more attention. But the damage was done. The murmurs in the cabin were growing. She didn't need to hear what was being said to know. She could feel it. Passengers who had ignored her before were watching now, some whispering to each other, some offering small, knowing smirks. A businessman near the front leaned toward his seatmate. "This is better than in-flight entertainment?" Ms. Collins clenched her jaw and forced herself to keep moving. Daniel, who had been observing the entire exchange from a few rows away, approached as she returned to the galley. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes that irritated her. "Tea and sparkling water," he mused. "Looks like they're settling in just fine." Ms. Collins turned sharply toward him. "Mind your own business, Daniel." He chuckled. "Oh, it's not just my business. I'd say the whole cabin is invested at this point." She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. "They want me gone. You think I don't know that?" Daniel shrugged, folding his arms. "I don't think they care if you're gone or not. I think they just wanted you to learn a lesson. And from where I'm standing?" He glanced toward Leonard and Evelyn. "Lesson delivered." She wanted to snap back, to regain even a shred of her former authority. But what was the point? No one was listening to her anymore. Her control over this flight had vanished the moment she dismissed the wrong people. And the worst part? The flight was still hours away from landing. Ms. Collins gripped the edge of the galley counter, her knuckles white. The whispers, the stolen glances, the quiet amusement on the faces of the passengers. It was unbearable. She had never felt this kind of scrutiny before. For years, she had walked through the first-class cabin with confidence, her authority unquestioned. She had been the one in control, setting the tone for every flight she worked. But now, she was the subject of conversation, the story unfolding before everyone's eyes. And the worst part, she had no one to blame but herself. She took a deep breath and smoothed out her uniform, reminding herself that this was just one flight. She would get through it. When they landed, she would speak with management, explain her side of things, and hopefully, this entire nightmare would blow over. At least that's what she told herself. But just as she steadied her breathing, Daniel returned to the galley, setting down an empty tray with a smirk still playing at the corner of his lips. "You might want to get ready for round 2, he said lightly. Ms. Collins stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Daniel gestured subtly toward the front of the cabin. "It looks like Mr. Carter just made a call." Her stomach dropped. She peeked out past the galley curtain, just in time to see Leonard putting his phone away. His expression was unreadable, but his influence was undeniable. Benjamin Carter had already issued a formal review mid-flight. What else was coming? Ms. Collins had a sinking feeling she was about to find out. A few minutes later, a small commotion at the front of the plane broke the lingering silence in first class. A well-dressed man in an airline operations suit stepped into the cabin from the cockpit door. Passengers sat up straighter. Some adjusted their seats, sensing something important was happening. Ms. Collins' throat went dry. She recognized him immediately. David Langford, an executive supervisor for in-flight operations. He wasn't just there by coincidence. He had been sent. David adjusted the cuffs of his suit and took a step toward Leonard and Evelyn's row. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced the entire cabin. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I want to personally apologize on behalf of Carter Airlines for any disrespect or inconvenience you've experienced today." Ms. Collins stopped breathing. Passengers turned their full attention toward the couple. Some stole glances at Ms. Collins, watching her reaction, waiting to see how this would unfold. Evelyn smiled warmly. "Oh, how kind of you, David. But I assure you, my husband and I are quite comfortable now." Leonard leaned back slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. "It's good to see you, David. I trust everything is being handled accordingly?" David nodded. "Yes, sir. As per Mr. Benjamin Carter's instructions, an official report is being filed regarding this incident." Ms. Collins' pulse pounded in her ears. "An official report?" David didn't even glance in her direction. Instead, he continued, his voice level but firm. "Additionally, as part of our service recovery policy, we've arranged a full luxury experience for you both upon landing. Private transportation, a stay at our premium partner hotel, and a formal in-person meeting with our executive team to address any concerns you may have." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Well, that certainly is above and beyond, isn't it?" Leonard gave a small nod. "It's appreciated." The tension in the air was suffocating. David hesitated for only a moment before finally acknowledging the elephant in the room. "And as for the situation with our crew today," he continued, finally turning his gaze toward Ms. Collins, "we take professionalism and respect for our passengers very seriously. I can assure you that further action will be taken once we land." Ms. Collins felt her stomach twist into a painful knot. Daniel, standing in the galley behind her, mouthed the word "ouch" under his breath. Passengers whispered. Some smirked. A few looked outright delighted by the unfolding drama. Ms. Collins tried to keep her breathing steady, but she had never felt so exposed in her entire career. This wasn't just a complaint anymore. This was a public takedown, and it was happening in real time. David straightened his suit and turned back to Leonard and Evelyn. "If there's anything else I can do for you during the remainder of the flight, please don't hesitate to let me know." Leonard smiled slightly. "I think we're in good hands." David nodded. "Then I'll return to the cockpit for now." And just like that, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Ms. Collins couldn't move. She couldn't even bring herself to turn around, to walk away, to pretend she was still in control of anything. Because the truth was clear now. She wasn't. She had gone from being in charge of first class to being completely powerless in her own cabin, and now there was nothing left to do except wait for the plane to land, where the real consequences were waiting for her. Ms. Collins stood frozen in the aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The first-class cabin, once a place where she commanded authority, now felt like a stage, and she was the main act in a humiliating performance. Passengers weren't even pretending to ignore what had just happened. Some exchanged amused glances, others whispered, and a few simply stared, waiting to see how she would react. She had never been the one under scrutiny before. She had always been the enforcer, the one who maintained order. But now order had slipped from her hands entirely, and she was left standing in the aftermath of her own arrogance. Daniel, still in the galley behind her, muttered under his breath, "This is painful to watch." Ms. Collins snapped her head toward him, her eyes flashing. "Not a word." He smirked but didn't push further. He didn't need to. The damage was already done, and everyone knew it. She needed to move. She needed to do something, anything, to regain even a shred of dignity. But what could she do? The situation was out of her hands. She had been publicly reprimanded, her actions recorded in an official report, and worst of all, she had been reduced to nothing more than an example of how not to treat a passenger. And not just any passengers. The owners of the airline. With great effort, she forced herself to move, stepping stiffly toward the galley. She couldn't hide, but she could at least get out of sight. As she passed by Leonard and Evelyn, she half expected them to gloat, to enjoy watching her downfall. But when she dared to glance at them, they weren't even looking at her. Evelyn was calmly stirring her tea, her hands steady, her face serene. Leonard had reopened his book, flipping a page without a second glance. They had moved on. That somehow made it even worse. Her fall from grace wasn't just humiliating, it was insignificant to them. They weren't the kind of people who thrived on making others suffer. They didn't need revenge. They simply let her destroy herself. She reached the galley and gripped the counter, exhaling sharply. The silence in first class was different now. It wasn't awkward. It was satisfied. It made her sick. A voice behind her broke through the tension. "You okay?" Miss Collins turned slightly, finding Daniel leaning against the counter, arms crossed. His expression wasn't mocking this time. It wasn't smug. It was curious. She straightened her shoulders, ignoring the burning in her chest. "I'm fine." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She didn't answer. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But Daniel wasn't done. He studied her for a moment before speaking again, his tone softer than before. "You know, if you just treated them like any other first-class passengers, none of this would have happened." Ms. Collins bristled. "I don't need a lecture from you." Daniel shrugged. "Suit yourself. But I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's career is hanging by a thread." He hesitated, then added, "And yours?" "It's unraveling by the second." Her stomach twisted violently. She already knew that. She didn't need Daniel to spell it out for her. For the next hour, she went through the motions of her duties, but she wasn't really there. Her body moved, serving drinks, adjusting trays, responding to passengers with forced politeness. But her mind was trapped in an endless spiral of what-ifs. What if she had just checked the manifest? What if she had treated Leonard and Evelyn with the same patience she gave to the wealthier-looking passengers? What if she had just taken one extra second to think before dismissing them? Would she still be in this position? Would she still have a job when they landed? She was afraid to know the answer. She didn't even realize how lost in thought she was until a familiar voice snapped her back to reality. Leonard Carter had stepped into the aisle, stretching his legs slightly. When she turned, she found him watching her, not with anger or smugness, but with curiosity. "You've been awfully quiet, Miss Collin," he said smoothly. She stiffened, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Carter." Leonard nodded, as if considering that. Then he asked the one question she wasn't prepared for. "Do you regret how you handled things?" The words felt heavier than they should have. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself, to say that she had been following protocol. But something in his expression told her that wouldn't work, because he wasn't asking for an excuse. He was asking for honesty. For the first time since the flight began, she hesitated. She wasn't sure what scared her more, his question or her answer. Ms. Collins stood stiffly in the aisle, feeling every pair of eyes in first class waiting for her response. The passengers who had been whispering before were now eerily silent, as if they sensed that this moment was different from the others. This wasn't just another uncomfortable exchange. This was a reckoning. Leonard Carter had given her an out, a chance to admit she was wrong, to salvage something before this flight landed, and her future was ripped from her hands. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Did she regret how she had handled things? She should have. She should have immediately said yes. But the problem was, regret wasn't something she had ever been forced to confront. For years, she had run this cabin her way. She had made judgments, quick decisions, assumptions about passengers. Most of the time, they never fought back. They grumbled, they gave up, and she went on with her job. But this time, she had miscalculated. This time, she had dismissed the wrong people. And now she was standing in the aftermath, a crumbling figure in a uniform that no longer gave her any authority. Leonard raised an eyebrow at her hesitation, his expression calm but unreadable. "I'll take your silence as an answer," he said smoothly, slipping his hands into his pockets. Ms. Collins' breath hitched. She started, but Leonard had already turned, walking back toward his seat. The conversation was over, and that was worse than any punishment she could have received. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others smiling slightly as if they had been waiting for this moment. Even Daniel, standing near the galley, exhaled sharply. "Wow," he muttered under his breath. Miss Collins felt sick. She had spent years building a reputation for herself, one that demanded respect, one that made her presence known in every cabin she worked. But now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. She turned sharply and stormed toward the galley, needing to get away from the weight of her own humiliation. But as she reached the back, she heard the intercom crackle to life again. "Ms. Collins, please report to the cockpit." A fresh wave of panic shot through her. Number not again. Passengers whispered as she passed by, the murmurs growing louder. They could feel it. Something else was about to happen. She reached the cockpit door, hesitated for only a second, then stepped inside. The moment she did, her stomach dropped. The video screen was on. And this time, it wasn't just Benjamin Carter waiting for her. It was the full Carter Airlines executive board. A long table stretched across the screen, with at least 10 high-ranking members seated. Some looked neutral, others looked downright displeased. But it was Benjamin who spoke first. "Ms. Collins," he said, voice calm but final. "Take a seat." Her knees nearly buckled. There was no seat in the cockpit. This wasn't a meeting. This wasn't a discussion. This was a verdict. She wasn't making it to landing as a flight attendant. She was about to lose everything. Ms. Collins stood frozen, the hum of the aircraft's instruments the only sound in the cockpit. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She wasn't just being questioned anymore. She was being sentenced. On the screen, Benjamin Carter clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. Beside him, various executives of Carter Airlines sat in stern silence. their gazes locked on her like she was a problem that needed to be dealt with. "Ms. Collins," Benjamin finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "We don't have much time before this flight lands, so let's get to the point." Ms. Collins felt a chill run through her spine. She had handled complaints before. She had been written up a few times for minor infractions, nothing serious. But this was completely different. Benjamin leaned slightly forward. "Your behavior on this flight was unacceptable, unprofessional, and in direct violation of Carter Airlines' customer service policies. Not only did you refuse a simple seating request, but you did so with complete disregard for the passengers involved." Ms. Collins licked her lips, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sir, if I may." One of the executives, a woman with neatly pinned black hair and sharp eyes, cut her off. "No, Ms. Collins, you may not," she said firmly. "We've reviewed the flight logs, the crew reports, and multiple passenger statements, including those from other first-class travelers who witnessed your actions firsthand." She glanced down at a document in front of her. "From what we've gathered, you displayed repeated bias and dismissiveness toward Mr. and Mrs. Carter without even verifying their request." Ms. Collins clenched her hands at her sides. "I wasn't aware of their identity." Benjamin exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "That's exactly the problem, Ms. Collins. You only see value in the people you deem important. You made an assumption based on appearance alone, and now you're facing the consequences." Her stomach twisted painfully. "Sir, I understand I may have misjudged the situation, but I've worked for this airline for years. I've been an excellent flight attendant. Surely—" Benjamin held up a hand, silencing her. "You've worked for this airline for years, and yet, in those years, you never learned the most important part of customer service." His voice was steady but firm. "Respect." Silence. The word hung in the air like a final nail in a coffin. Miss Collins felt a lump rise in her throat. She had lost control. Completely. There was no salvaging this, no talking her way out of it. Benjamin glanced at one of the executives, who gave a small nod before speaking. "After careful review, we've made a decision regarding your employment with Carter Airlines." Ms. Collins' breath caught. Here it was. "You are hereby suspended indefinitely, effective immediately upon landing." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Suspended. Indefinitely. Her mouth went dry. "But," the executive continued, flipping a page, "given the severity of this situation and the nature of your actions, we are also placing you under formal review for permanent termination." Her body felt cold. This couldn't be happening. "Sir, please," she tried, her voice no longer sharp and confident, but desperate. "I understand my mistake now. I shouldn't have dismissed them, but I was just following procedure." "No, Ms. Collins," Benjamin said, his voice steely. "Procedure doesn't excuse bias. Procedure doesn't excuse making passengers feel like they don't belong. You had every opportunity to check the manifest, to verify their tickets, to offer them the same courtesy you give others. And you didn't." Ms. Collins' throat burned. She had spent years training new flight attendants, teaching them how to command respect in the cabin. But now she had none left. One of the board members sighed, looking directly at her. Had this been a single incident, perhaps there would have been room for leniency. But this wasn't an isolated event. Ms. Collins blinked. "What?" Benjamin turned toward another executive, who pulled up a file. "We reviewed past complaints, Ms. Collins. Over the last 2 years, multiple passengers have reported similar treatment from you, being dismissed, talked down to, or denied basic accommodations without proper verification. Your file contains more internal complaints than most employees accumulate in their entire careers." Ms. Collins felt her world tilting. She had received complaints before, sure. Every flight attendant did. But she had never thought they'd actually stacked up against her. Benjamin sighed, tapping a finger on the desk in front of him. This was the last straw. Ms. Collins felt lightheaded. She was losing everything. Benjamin's voice softened, but it wasn't out of sympathy. It was final. "I hope this serves as a lesson, Ms. Collins, because the truth is, you didn't lose your job today because of who my parents are." He let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "You lost your job because of who you are." The screen went dark. She stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but there was nothing left to say. Captain Hayes cleared his throat, breaking the suffocating silence. "You should return to your post for the remainder of the flight," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. "But when we land, security will escort you off the aircraft." Ms. Collins didn't move. Her body felt heavy. Her career, her entire identity, had just shattered in a matter of hours. The sharp, confident woman who had stepped onto this plane, she was gone, and in her place was someone she no longer recognized. Ms. Collins stepped out of the cockpit, her legs moving automatically while her mind spiraled in a haze of disbelief. She wasn't sure if she was breathing properly. Her career, her years of work, her sense of authority, her entire identity had just unraveled in front of her. Indefinitely suspended. Under review for permanent termination. Her hands clenched at her sides as she walked stiffly down the aisle, every step feeling heavier than the last. She could still feel the presence of the passengers, their attention shifting toward her like she was a walking disaster. She had been in control of this flight, and now she was barely even a part of it. Daniel was standing near the galley, arms crossed, watching her approach. She knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. "Well," he said casually, "that looked intense." Ms. Collins shot him a glare, but she didn't have the energy to snap back. She walked past him, focusing on the service station, trying to steady herself. Daniel didn't move, but he also didn't let her brush him off so easily. "So," he continued, leaning against the counter, "that little meeting, was it what I think it was?" She exhaled sharply, gripping the counter. "Drop it, Daniel," he whistled lowly. "So that's a yes." Her nails dug into her palm. "I said drop it." Daniel let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You know, I almost feel bad for you." She turned to face him, her patience finally snapping. "You almost feel bad for me?" His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked genuinely curious. "I mean, yeah," he said with a shrug. "It's gotta suck, going from untouchable to unemployed all in one flight." Her chest tightened painfully. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Daniel continued, his voice more thoughtful now. "But here's the thing, Collins. You've been treating people like this for years. You've dismissed passengers, humiliated them, walked through this cabin like you were above everyone else." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "And the one time it backfires, you expect sympathy?" Miss Collins swallowed hard. She hated how the words sank in like poison. Daniel wasn't mocking her. He was right. She had built her reputation on being uncompromising, untouchable, feared. And now she was none of those things. Passengers who once avoided eye contact now openly watched her. A few whispered, and though she couldn't hear them, she knew exactly what they were saying. That's her. The flight attendant who got humiliated. The one who tried to throw around her authority and lost everything. The one who didn't realize who she was talking to. Ms. Collins turned away from Daniel and grabbed a stack of napkins, pretending to organize them. Anything to keep herself busy. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Guess I'll let you process that." He turned and walked off, heading down the aisle with a kind of easy confidence she suddenly envied. He had his job. He had respect from the passengers. He had no worries about what would happen when the plane landed. Unlike her. The next 30 minutes passed in a strange, disorienting blur. She moved through the motions of her job, but her hands felt disconnected from the rest of her body. When she refilled glasses, no one thanked her. When she cleared away plates, passengers barely acknowledged her presence. She had once been respected, even feared on flights like this. But now, she was nothing. She could hear small pockets of conversation happening around her. Some passengers tried to act normal, returning to their in-flight movies, typing away on their laptops, sipping their champagne. But others were still enjoying the spectacle. "Unbelievable," a woman near the front murmured to her husband. "She was so rude before, and now look at her." "She deserves it," the man whispered back. "Can you imagine how many people she's treated like that?" Further down, another passenger chuckled under his breath. "I'd be handing out free drinks if I were her. Maybe try to get some good customer reviews before she's out of a job." Ms. Collins felt every single word like a needle under her skin. Her fingers gripped the tray she was holding so tightly that she thought it might snap in half. This was the longest flight of her life. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to step off this plane and disappear, but she didn't get that choice. Because just as she thought the worst was behind her, the final humiliation arrived. Leonard Carter stood up. Passengers immediately noticed. Evelyn turned her head toward him, raising an eyebrow, but she said nothing as he adjusted his blazer and walked toward the front of the cabin. Miss Collins froze. He wasn't walking toward the bathroom. He wasn't stretching his legs. He was walking toward her. The conversations died instantly. She swallowed hard as Leonard stopped a few feet away, hands tucked into his pockets, looking at her with the same unreadable expression he had held for most of the flight. For a brief, desperate moment, she considered fleeing to the galley. But what good would that do? There was no running from this. Not anymore. Leonard tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You know," he said casually, "I've been thinking about something." Ms. Collins felt the world tilt. "Sir?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, letting the moment stretch, letting everyone watch. Then finally he spoke. "I've flown thousands of times in my life," he said, "met hundreds of flight attendants. Most of them were kind, professional, respectful." He let the words sit there, heavy and deliberate. "And then," he continued, "there were ones like you." The air cracked with tension. Ms. Collins felt her throat tighten. Leonard took a slow step forward. "Tell me something, Miss Collins. When you looked at me and my wife earlier, when you dismissed us, when you barely even glanced at our tickets," his eyes bored into her, "who exactly did you think we were?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. He smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what I thought." Miss Collins felt her entire body flush with shame. Leonard nodded once, then turned and walked back to his seat without another word. Passengers openly stared now. A few smirked. One even shook his head with a look that screamed, "You brought this on yourself." Ms. Collins felt like she had been burned alive. And the worst part, she knew without a doubt that she would never be able to walk onto another plane without remembering this moment. This was who she would be known as forever. The flight attendant who thought she was untouchable, until she wasn't. The weight of Leonard Carter's words settled over Ms. Collins like a suffocating fog. He had destroyed her without raising his voice, without anger, without any need for insults. He had let her crumble under the weight of her own mistakes, and now she had to live in that moment. She stood motionless, tray in hand, as Leonard returned to his seat. Evelyn gave her husband a small smile as he sat back down, but she didn't say anything, because nothing needed to be said. The silence in the cabin stretched on for a few unbearable seconds before the whispers began again. Passengers weren't even trying to be discreet anymore. "That was brutal. She deserved it. I wish I had recorded that." Ms. Collins could feel their words, each one cutting into her, deepening the realization that she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just another flight attendant walking through the aisles. She was the center of the story now, and she would be for a long, long time. She forced herself to move. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her tray, trying to look busy, trying to ignore the way her skin burned under the attention. Her head pounded with a dull ache, her heartbeat was too fast, and her breath felt wrong, too shallow, too unsteady. She had been humiliated, not just professionally, personally, because what made this so much worse wasn't just that she had lost her job. It was that she had lost who she thought she was. For years, she had walked through first-class cabins with authority, believing she was someone people had to respect. She had trained herself to be untouchable, to never waver, to never second-guess her decisions. But today she had been stripped of everything. Passengers no longer feared her. They no longer tried to impress her. They pitied her. She had become small, disposable. She had spent years thinking she had control over this cabin, over the passengers, over everything around her. And yet all it took was one decision, one assumption, to tear it all away. She barely heard Daniel return to the galley behind her. He set down a tray and leaned casually against the counter, watching her with an unreadable expression. For once, he didn't look smug. For once, he wasn't gloating. Ms. Collins felt her throat tighten, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She kept her back straight, her face unreadable, but Daniel knew better. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice lower than before. "I know exactly what you're feeling right now." She didn't respond. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, I've seen flight attendants lose their jobs before, but I've never seen someone self-destruct mid-flight like that." Her fingers curled into her palm. "If you're here to gloat, don't." Daniel shrugged. "I'm not gloating." He hesitated, then added, "But I am wondering something." She glanced at him, irritated. "What?" He tilted his head. "If you could go back to the beginning of this flight, would you do anything differently?" Her jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter now." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't it?" She wanted to snap back, wanted to say something sharp and cutting, to shut down the conversation before it went any further. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, she did regret it. She regretted all of it. She regretted not checking the manifest. She regretted her tone, her assumptions, her quick dismissal of two people who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. She regretted not realizing how easily she could be replaced, because that's what she was now, replaceable. She had always believed she was valuable, that the airline needed her, that her experience, her authority, her way of managing the cabin was something they couldn't afford to lose. But now she was a liability, and soon she'd be nothing at all. Daniel exhaled softly. "You know, the thing about people like Leonard Carter?" Ms. Collins didn't answer. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "They don't have to raise their voice," he said. "They don't have to get angry. They don't have to punish you." He gestured toward the cabin. "Because the real punishment is living with the fact that you did this to yourself." Ms. Collins looked down at her hands. For the first time in her career, she had no defense, no excuse, no power, nothing. Just the knowledge that she had made the biggest mistake of her life, and there was no coming back from it. Ms. Collins had never been the type to second-guess herself. She had built her career on certainty, on the belief that she belonged in first class, commanding authority over passengers, guiding the experience with an ironclad grip. But now, as she stood in the galley, every ounce of that confidence was gone. She had spent years believing that she mattered, that passengers had to listen to her, that her word was final. And yet, as she turned her head slightly, she caught sight of Leonard and Evelyn Carter sitting comfortably, engaged in quiet conversation, as if nothing had happened, as if her entire world hadn't just collapsed. She expected them to still be watching her, to be reveling in her downfall. But they weren't. They weren't thinking about her at all. That realization hit harder than anything else. Her downfall didn't matter to them. They had already moved on. The most devastating thing wasn't that she was losing her job. It was that her presence had never been important to begin with. She exhaled shakily, her fingers gripping the counter behind her, as she felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was something deeper, a hollow, sinking feeling that told her, this wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern. How many people had she dismissed over the years? How many passengers had she brushed aside, barely glancing at them because she assumed they weren't important? She thought back to the business travelers who had gotten her full attention, the wealthy, well-dressed men and women she had prioritized, ensuring their needs were met before anyone else's. And then she thought of all the others, the elderly passengers she had ignored when they needed help with their bags, the young mother who had asked for an extra blanket for her toddler, only to be met with a sigh and an eye roll, the nervous first-time flyer she had dismissed as an inconvenience rather than a person. She thought about them all, and for the first time, she realized she didn't like the person she had become. She hated it. She had spent years looking down on others, and now everyone was looking down on her. For the first time in her career, she understood how it felt to be powerless. Daniel had gone back to work, moving down the aisle with a sense of ease she suddenly envied. He didn't have to force his presence. He didn't demand respect. He just did his job. And yet passengers liked him. They trusted him. They looked him in the eye when they spoke to him. She had spent years thinking respect came from control. Now she realized it came from something else entirely. Daniel had earned it. She had forced it. And now that she had lost it, she understood the difference. She turned her head slightly, watching as Daniel offered a passenger a refill, exchanging a brief, light-hearted comment that made the man chuckle. Something so simple, something she had once thought of as unimportant. And yet, that was the job. It wasn't about being in control, it was about being of service. She had never understood that until now, and it was too late. Her breath felt uneven. This was really happening. She had spent so much time pretending to be untouchable, convinced that her seniority would protect her. But the truth was, no one was untouchable. Not her. Not anyone. Her hands trembled as she adjusted a stack of napkins, trying to keep herself together. She had never felt this exposed before. The whispers in the cabin weren't as loud as before, but she could still feel them. She had become a spectacle, a lesson for everyone on board. And the flight wasn't even over. She heard footsteps approaching. For a brief second she tensed, expecting another wave of humiliation. But when she turned, it wasn't a passenger. It was Evelyn. Miss Collins' stomach tightened. She straightened her posture immediately, forcing her expression into something neutral. But she couldn't mask the shame in her eyes. Evelyn Carter wasn't smiling. She wasn't smug or cruel. If anything, she looked thoughtful. She held her tea in one hand, the other resting at her side. She didn't speak right away, simply watching Ms. Collins with a quiet kind of patience. Ms. Collins hated the way it made her feel. Finally, Evelyn sighed and shook her head. "You know, dear," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I don't think you're a bad person." Ms. Collins' throat went dry. She hadn't expected kindness. Evelyn continued, adjusting her grip on her cup. "But I do think you got lost somewhere along the way." Ms. Collins stiffened. She didn't want to hear this. Not now. Not when she had already lost. Evelyn took a sip of her tea, then met Ms. Collins' gaze directly. "Do you remember what I said earlier? About how some flight attendants are wonderful?" Ms. Collins did remember. She swallowed hard, nodding slightly. Evelyn tilted her head. "And some forget that the people they serve are people too." Ms. Collins clenched her jaw, but she couldn't argue. Because Evelyn was right. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform, tension pulling at every muscle in her body. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to wake up and undo everything, but she couldn't. She could only stand there and take it. Evelyn gave her a long, thoughtful look. "It's not too late to be better," she said quietly, "but that's up to you." She turned and walked away, returning to her seat as if she hadn't just shattered Ms. Collins' entire worldview with a single conversation. Ms. Collins watched her go, something strange and unfamiliar twisting in her chest. Because for the first time in her career, she wasn't just angry at the consequences. She was angry at herself. And that realization hurt the most. Ms. Collins stood in the galley, gripping the counter so tightly that her fingers ached. Evelyn's words lingered in the space around her, heavier than anything she had heard all day. "It's not too late to be better, but that's up to you." She didn't know why those words affected her so much. Maybe because no one had ever told her that before. Not in a way that mattered. The flight was nearing its descent. Soon the aircraft would land, and her fate, one she had spent years avoiding, would be sealed. Security would be waiting. She would be escorted out. Her uniform, once a symbol of her authority, would become meaningless. Her career was over. And yet, the thing that haunted her the most wasn't losing her job. It was the knowledge that this wasn't just about today. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about who she had been for years. Her mind replayed past flights. The faces of passengers she had dismissed, the looks of frustration or embarrassment that she had ignored, the small moments where she had chosen arrogance over kindness, power over respect. She had spent years believing that authority meant being above others, and today had proven how wrong she was. Because real power doesn't come from control, it comes from respect. And respect, she had never truly earned it. She felt sick. For the first time, she wondered what might have been different if she had simply been better. Would she still be on this flight? Would she still have a future with this airline? Would she be respected, not feared? Daniel returned to the galley, adjusting his uniform. "We're beginning descent," he said casually. "Captain just made the announcement." She barely nodded, staring down at the counter. Daniel studied her for a moment before leaning slightly against the wall. "I gotta admit," he said, tilting his head, I thought you'd be fighting this harder." Miss Collins didn't respond because she realized something terrifying. She wasn't fighting it anymore because deep down, she knew she deserved it. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his chin. "So what now?" She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What now? There was no plan, no escape, no last-minute argument that would fix this. For the first time in years, she had no control over what happened next. And maybe that was the point. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know." Daniel raised an eyebrow, almost impressed by the honesty. For the rest of the descent, she went through the motions of her job silently. No commands, no stiff orders, no overcompensating, just silence. And then finally, the landing. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling down the runway. Passengers shifted in their seats, unbuckling seatbelts, stretching, checking their phones. To them, this was just another flight. For Ms. Collins, it was the last flight of her career. She watched as Leonard and Evelyn Carter remained seated, waiting patiently as the rest of the cabin gathered their belongings. Her heart pounded. This was it. She took a step forward, forcing her legs to move. As she reached Leonard and Evelyn's row, she stopped. For a brief moment, she considered just walking away, letting them leave without a word. But something inside her wouldn't let her. She turned to them, swallowed hard, forced herself to face the people who had changed everything. Leonard met her gaze evenly. Evelyn simply waited. Ms. Collins inhaled, and then, for the first time in years, she let go of her pride. "I'm sorry," the words felt foreign in her mouth. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying her. "For what?" Ms. Collins felt her throat tighten. For everything," she admitted. "Not just today, not just this flight, but for how I've been, for how I treated you, and for how I've treated others." She exhaled. "I thought respect came from power, but I was wrong." Leonard watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. Evelyn smiled softly. "That's a good start," Evelyn said simply. Ms. Collins swallowed, not expecting forgiveness. And maybe she didn't deserve it, but for the first time in a long time, she had done something she never thought she would. She had admitted she was wrong. Leonard gave her a small nod before standing, adjusting his blazer. Evelyn rose as well, gathering her things. And then they walked past her. No further words, no dramatic farewell. They had already moved on. Miss Collins watched them go, the weight of everything pressing into her chest. She didn't know what her future looked like, but she knew one thing. She would never be the same person she was before this flight. And maybe that was the real consequence, the one she would have to carry for the rest of her life. If you think this flight attendant got what she deserved, hit the like button. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Was the punishment fair? And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this.